Hello, petals. Thank you for joining me again for Chapter 8 of You Don't Have to Be Evil to Work Here, but It Helps. So there's a little bit of confusion as to whether this is J.W. Wells & Co. Book 1, as it says in the ebook, or if it's Book 4, like most of us fans of Tom Holt believe. I had this conversation with my nearest and dearest this afternoon, and yes, we have agreed this is Book 4, having read the previous ones multiple times. I digress. If you enjoy what I'm doing here, please hit the notifications bell, leave me a like, let me know that you're enjoying it, and if you've got any feedback or comments, and if you want to get involved with the conversation about is it Book 4 or is it Book 1, please leave a comment in the comment section. I always like to hear from you. Anyway, I'm going to stop waffling. Chapter 8. You don't have to be evil to work here, but it helps. J.W. Wells & Co. Book 4. Here we go. They can't do that, Cassie said. Really? Connie glared at her. Oh, I see what you mean. I could take them to the Industrial Tribunal for wrongful dismissal or whatever it's called. Well, it'd be fun, I suppose, watching a whole room full of lawyers getting turned into white mice. But I don't think it'd achieve anything positive. Of course they can do it. They can do anything. Look it up in the dictionary, under M, for magic. She sighed. Well, she said, that's it, I suppose. Nobody's going to give me another job at my age. In 6 months' time, I'll be one of those sad old creatures you see in supermarkets, wheeling around a trolley full of frozen dinners and cat food. I'll be able to do gardening and watch the daytime soaps. Won't that be bloody fun? But that's stupid, Cassie objected. You know more about the business than anybody I've ever met. You earn them pots and pots of money. You, not a team player, they said. Connie interrupted grimly. They feel I'm too set in my ways to adapt to the challenges of the new post-rationalisation corporate structure. Also, they seem to have got it into their heads that I'm a teeny bit stroppy. What gave them that idea? I honestly couldn't say. She shook her head sadly. 2 weeks' notice, though. Of course they'd understand if I want to leave earlier. Fat chance, she spat. I never did get the hang of knowing when I'm beaten. Lack of practice, I guess. But it doesn't make sense, Cassie maintained. You were going to retire anyway. That's management for you, Connie said wearily. The maximum brutality working hand in hand with the minimum logic to achieve the worst possible outcome. It's the proud old tradition of British industrial relations. No, they could see I wasn't going to wear my baseball cap and be a happy camper, so they flushed me down the bog, and the hell with 30 years of bloody hard work. She shrugged. It's not like it matters, she added. Like you said, I was going to pack it in anyway. It's letting the little shits beat me that I don't like. It goes against the grain somehow. Cassie couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't be irritating at best. I'm really sorry, she said. I think it's a rotten thing to do. In fact, got a good mind to tell them where they can stick their stupid job. You could do that, Connie replied, and we could go into business together, making soft toys and homemade jam, since neither of us have been able to get a proper job. Sweet idea, but don't bother on my account. Now, if you don't mind, I want to sit quietly on my own and think despairing thoughts. Push off, she translated, and Cassie left. So, Connie thought. She looked around her, considering the boundaries of the life she had just had taken away from her. From where she sat, she could see the filing cabinet whose drawers had never closed properly, the carpet that rocked up under the door, the empty bubble where the wallpaper had come away from the wall, the standard issue print of London Bridge that had suddenly turned up one day without any explanation. She'd taken it down and thrown it out once. It was back in place the next morning. The floor-to-ceiling books stuffed with information she wouldn't be needing any more. The visitor's chair that squeaked. It was a cage, and the zookeepers came round from time to time to push work under the door, and when she'd gone, they'd probably knock through to extend the computer room. She thought of all the hours she'd bled in this room. irreplaceable units of the slim margin between birth and death. What, after all, is life but 80-odd quid you get out of the cash point to pay some bill or other, and end up frittering away on impulse buys and special offers that you don't actually want? Yes, but she knew all that already. The interesting aspect was why they'd chosen to dump on her now, as opposed to, say, later. Lying on her desk was that old copy of Levinson and de Pina. Suddenly she remembered why she'd taken it down off the shelf. Go winky-dink? Absolutely. Nevertheless, Connie pulled the book towards her and flicked through until she found the place. She was reading and making notes when there was a knock at the door and Mr. Tanner came in. "Dennis," she said, "haven't seen you in a while." Mr. Tanner wasn't looking her in the eye, which meant he'd heard about her getting the sack.
"Been run off my feet by the bastard auditors," he said.
"They're still here, then?"
"Oh, yes," he sighed. "Busy little bees. They've been through half the files in the building. They've had all the ledgers and the paying-in books and the VAT stuff and the PAYE accounts. Now they want a whole lot more files and the bank statements for the last 3 years. I'll say this for them," he added. "They're thorough."
"Apart from that, though," Connie said, "you've made friends with them, I trust. Passed around the family snapshots. Talked about United's chances in the league this season. All that sort of thing." Mr. Tanner laughed.
"Yeah, right," he said. "These 3 blokes who look like the Nazgul in pinstripes, and a skinny hatchet-faced bird who keeps saying 'well' at me every time she asks me a question, and I don't answer inside half a second. If death's half as scary, I'll have to think seriously about living forever. You got the Takemura file, Randy?"
Connie opened her filing cabinet and handed it over. "What do they want that for?" she asked. "It was just a poxy little job, and it was all wrapped up 3 years ago." Mr. Tanner shrugged.
"You ask them if you like," he said, "and if you do, and that bony cow looks at you and turns you to stone, can I have you for a bird bath stand? You look good now, along with starlings up and about on your head."
When he'd gone, Connie reached for the book and read a little more. Then she reached for the phone. "Rosie," she said, "do me a favour. Give me Hollingshead and Farron. Not the boss," she added. "The son. What's his name? Colin Hollinghead." "Thanks." From time to time, you do get trees growing inside industrial premises. The difference is they're neatly planted in pots, strategically placed so that visiting buyers can discreetly empty their glasses of disgusting white wine into them at sales presentations. What you don't tend to get is trees growing straight up through the carpet, and especially not overnight. "Oh, God," Colin thought, and he reached out and wiped his fingertips on the bark. Just as he'd expected, the exact same texture as the one at home. It was a curious thing. For some reason or other, it spent an unreasonably large amount of time over the years looking through gardening books and tree books, and yet it never quite managed to pin down the species of the stupid big growing thing that filled the stairwell at home. Just when he was sure it was an oak or a sequoia or a Japanese maple, he'd find another book and realise it was nothing of the kind, or it might just possibly be an ornamental dogwood or an Amazonian babinga. Whatever it was, though, there were now 2 of it. How nice. Staring and prodding at the horrible thing wasn't going to achieve anything. He passed it by and went to his office. As he pushed open the door, he heard the burbling of the phone. Her voice. The sound of it made him catch his breath. No doubt about it, then. "This is Connie Schwartz-Alberish calling for you from J.W. Wells," she said. What? He'd forgotten all about JWW and everything they implied. How could you possibly forget about something like that?
"Sorry, right, yes, put her through. Thanks."
Connie Schwartz, whatever she'd said. Who? Never mind. "Hello?" said her voice.
Hello," he said back. "Colin Hollingshead," he remembered.
"Connie Schwartz-Alberish. It's all right. You don't know me from a hole in the ground, but you have met my colleague, Cassandra Clay."
"Yes,"
Colin said.
and he meant it.
"Right."
Pause.
The voice was brisk. normally the sort of tone he'd be intimidated by. And he was, but not nearly as much as he'd usually have been. "You got a minute?"
"Sure," Colin replied. "Is this about—"
"No." Another pause, although slightly shorter this time. "It's really more a sort of personal matter. Look, it's difficult to explain. I don't suppose there's any chance you could spare me half an hour? This evening, preferably. 7-ish?"
I suppose so," Colin said doubtfully. "Why?"
"If I could explain why over the phone, I wouldn't need to come dragging out all the way to Richmond, wherever the hell you are. And sorry," the voice added, "I'm having one of those days. Actually, I've been having one of those lives, but it's only just starting to catch up with me."
"I don't know," Colin said. "Is it important?"
He caught the sound of breath being intaken at the other end of the line.
"It's important," he added quickly. "Look, excuse me if this sounds really strange, but might it have something to do with why we've got a tree growing up through the middle of our lounge?"
He had no idea why he'd said that, but to his great surprise, the voice replied, "Interesting. A tree?"
"Yes."
"Anything's possible."
Pause.
"You're sure it's a tree?"
"Absolutely fucking positive."
"Right." The voice sounded thoughtful. Not thoughtful as in, should I tell someone where I'm going and be sure to take along my personal security alarm? Thoughtful as in, oh. "Ash?"
"What?"
"Is it an ash tree?"
"No."
"Oh, you do know what an ash tree looks like?"
"Yes, and it isn't one. It's not any kind of tree I've ever seen anywhere else. Look."
Ah. The dictionaries are pretty useless on the subject, but there can be an infinity of difference between an ah and an ooh. "Right. Where shall I meet you? I'll be coming on the train from the city." The rest of Colin's working day was almost mockingly orthodox. He stuffed circulars into envelopes. He went down to Crudgington's to pick up 5 boxes of dovetail cutters for the big CNC mills in the tool room. He filed some letters for Uncle Chris. Life was teasing him, pretending to be normal when it patently wasn't. On the positive side, Fam smiled at him 4 times, laughed at 2 jokes, agreed with his views on the latest Trinny and Susanna show, and happened to mention in passing that she quite fancied seeing the new Mel Gibson film. All that was, of course, wonderful. It was only its juxtaposition with all the sub-Kuntzian melodrama that made it seem bizarre. He got rid of the 90 minutes between end of work and 7 o'clock after the fashion of the sea grinding down a cliff. Most of it he spent in a grim little pub just down from the station, where he spun out a glass of Pepsi and failed to read the Evening Standard. At 5 to 7, he got up and wandered over to the ticket barrier. At 7:10, he had just resolved to give it 10 more minutes and then go home, when a middle-aged woman in a Marks and Spencer coat appeared in front of him like a decloaking Romulan and said, "You're Colin Hollinghead?"
"Yes."
"Fine. I need a drink. Lead the way." Which he did with tolerable efficiency. She bought, which both impressed and relieved Colin, since he suddenly realised, as they walked into the pub, that he only had £2.76 on him. For some reason, he felt inclined to trust her, probably because she was middle-aged and female, or some daft superficial reason of that kind. In his narrow and slight experience, middle-aged women were calm, efficient voices on the other end of phones, sorting out botched deliveries, explaining incomprehensible Department of Trade export licence regulations, or telling him in words of 1 syllable how to install broadband on the office computer. Leaving aside his mother, easily done, he'd never been let down or dumped on by a middle-aged female, though of course there was a first time for everything. "Now then," she said, as they sat across a table in the quiet corner next to the broken fruit machine, "I've got a theory, and I need you to help me prove it. All right?" Colin nodded. "Sure," he said. "Is it to do with—" "I'm coming to that."
"Are you? I mean, fine. Sorry."
"All right." She seemed to brace herself, as though she was nervous. The thought of someone being nervous talking to him struck Colin as faintly absurd. You've met my colleague, Miss Clay?
Yes.
The woman thought for a moment. All the time you were with her, you had this unaccountable feeling that something extremely weird was going on, but you couldn't quite figure out what it was. Colin nodded. You know what it is that we do at JWW?
Sort of.
He took a deep breath.
You're wizards. Sorry, witches, I suppose, in your...
Connie gave him a weary look. Hint, she said. Not the W word. It's got the wrong connotations, you know. Old men in long white beards, crones with cats, teenagers larking about in the sky on broomsticks. We prefer the word magical practitioners, though old-timers like me still say sorcerers. Amounts to the same thing, but it doesn't make me cringe when I hear it.
All right, Colin said. Sorcerers, you do magic.
He hesitated for a moment, and then added,
You're arranging for my dad to sell his soul to the devil.
The relative positions of the woman's nose, mouth, and eyebrows gave Colin the impression that she didn't hold with that sort of thing, but wasn't quite prepared to admit as much to someone outside of the trade. I imagine you're not thrilled by that.
Not really.
Don't blame you. If I were you, I'd talk him out of it.
You don't know my dad.
True, but that's beside the point. Listen, she then told him about temporal displacement theory. She was better at explaining than Messrs. Levinson and DePino, which was just as well. Ring any bells? She concluded. It was Colin's turn to think.
Yes, he said. I mean, yes, that could be me. But hang on, you're saying that I'm being, well, like, possessed or something?
He heard himself say that, almost as though he was eavesdropping on someone else, and his hand shook, spilling beer on his knees.
Someone else has taken me over, and they're making me feel like I'm in love with her.
Connie pursed her lips. Nearly, she said, but not quite. It's not a case of malicious little gremlins squatting inside your head and ordering you abide. It's more, more impersonal than that. It's got more in common with catching a cold than invasion of the body snatchers. The thing is, she went on, it's a really huge coincidence that both of you seem to have gone down with the same thing. Trust me, that's really unusual. In fact, I can't think of a single case study where it's happened before. She drank some of her gin and tonic, then said, Why don't you tell me about it in your own words? That sounded a bit too much like English homework for Colin's taste, but he did his best.
And the crazy part of it is, he concluded with a rush, since all this stuff started, I've met someone else who I think I really do like a lot, and some of the things I'm feeling now are pretty much the same, but a lot of them are different. Like with this other girl I mentioned,
He made an effort and found some words that more or less got the job done.
It feels much more like me, if you see what I mean. The stuff with Cassie doesn't feel like me at all. It's like I suddenly stopped talking normally and started saying everything in blank verse. It feels all wrong, but at the same time it's really definitely there, if you get me. Almost, he added with a frown. It's like it's all happened before, and I'm remembering it, which can't make any sense, surely.
Connie looked at him oddly and said, I'll be the judge of that. Now then, what's all this about a tree?
2 trees, actually.
Colin studied her for a moment and realised that she was actually taking him seriously. So he told her about it, the whole shebang, starting with his early childhood and putting in all the details he could call to mind. When he'd finished, all she said was, And you're sure it's not an ash?
Yes.
Okay. Not an apple either.
I've got books out of the library, he said. Alan Tishmarsh and everything. It's not anything in any of them.
That's very strange, Connie said. That's the bummer with mysteries, of course. One particular detail catches your attention and reminds you of something, and so you don't pay proper attention to the rest of it, and you wind up completely screwed. I mean, here's me backing on about species, but this tree definitely goes up through your roof and then disappears.
Oh, yes.
Connie shook her head. I'll have to think about that one, she said. There's something lurking at the back of my mind, but I must have ticked it off somehow, because it's sulking and won't come out to play. Meanwhile, we've got to assume that it's nothing to do with the other stuff, which is hard to take, she added irritably, because 2 separate lots of weirdness happening to one civilian, no offence, is pretty bloody unlikely if you ask me. Tell me, do you do the lottery? Sometimes, Colin admitted. No luck so far? Obviously. No. Maybe you should stick with it, Connie said. I mean, it'd solve a lot of problems if you won. Well, of course it would. Ignore me, only you remind me a bit about the old joke about Cyprus being a place that produces more history than can be consumed locally. You do seem to have an awful lot of luck, far more than your fair share. Pity it's all bad luck, really. She shook herself like a wet dog and went on. The tree thing probably isn't anything to worry about, but the other business is turning my colleague into a nervous wreck, and I don't suppose it's much fun for you either. And the larks your father's getting up to. She pulled a face. I'll be straight with you. If you promise not to breathe a word of it to anybody at JWW. In our profession, ethics is generally just someone talking with a lisp about southern East Anglia, but most of us do draw a line somewhere, eventually. Trouble is, the firm's just been taken over, and the new management isn't too picky about who it does business with. Seems to me, she added with a slight edge to her voice, that if you helped Cassie sort out her bit of bother, and that'll be doing you some good too, don't let's forget, then she might be inclined to be grateful, which might lead her to make a complete balls-up of this routine sale and purchase. Completely out of character, that'd be, because she's pretty good at her work most of the time. But everybody makes mistakes occasionally. Colin nodded. I think she'd be happy to do that, he said. Only she doesn't know how. I mean, how to make a mess of it, so the other lot pull out. Connie smiled beautifully. That's just youthful inexperience, she said. When you've been in this trade as long as I have, you learn a thing or two about how perfectly simple, straightforward, do it standing on your head whistling Chattanooga choo-choo jobs can go horribly wrong in the twinkling of an eye. So, have you got a deal? I guess so, Colin said, feeling vaguely stunned. Sorry if I sound a bit out of it, but I'm new to all of this. A few days ago I thought magic was sawing girls in half, and Paul Daniels. Did you really? Connie shook her head. Well, don't beat yourself up too much about that. Let me tell you a secret about our profession. Basically, it's all about giving a tiny minority of the population a hugely unfair advantage over everybody else. If everybody could get at it, there'd be no point, because it'd be the proverbial level playing field. And then you'd get cowboy sorcery outfits in every high street. You'd have watchdogs and ombudsmen and EU directives and disgruntled customers ringing up you and yours, and everything would grind to a halt. So, instead, we confine ourselves to the very, very few people who can afford to pay our extortionate bills. We help them to get even richer still, and the rest of the world gets screwed rotten without even knowing it. Everything's normal. Everybody's happy. It's a noble calling, but it's all I've got. Or it was, she added, frowning. But that's none of your concern. Leave it with me, she said, finishing her drink, and I'll see what I can do. She grinned. Think of me as your fairy godmother, she said. I'll wave my magic wand. Have you got one? Colin said. A real one? She looked at him. I'll pretend you didn't say that. Anyway, I'll be in touch. Now, we've got some idea of what the problem actually is. Solving it ought to be relatively simple. Probably a great big anticlimax. It usually is. We just like to dress it up in funky long words so we can pad the bill out a bit. Still, I don't suppose you're the first person in galactic history that this has happened to. Colin looked at her. A moment ago you said I was. You said... Connie made a dismissive gesture. I say all sorts of things, she replied. It's a side effect of charging by the hour. The more I think about it, the more I'm inclined to view that it's probably just a little bit of fluff on the points of the space-time continuum. Really screws things up for you. But to wipe with an oily rag and a squirt of WD-40 and you'll be back on the rails in no time.
You think so?
I was in the trade before you were born, she said, getting up. I'll call you as soon as I've got anything concrete, as the developer said to the mafioso. Nice to meet you. Colin watched her leave. Very strange. She had paid to change her mind in mid-floor, and now it was all a storm in a teacup. No big deal. In which case, why'd she come halfway across Greater London in her own time to talk about it? He got himself another drink and had a nice quiet brood with a panic chaser. Forget his dad making a pact with the evil one. Forget the tree, and now the other fucking tree. Focus instead on the notion that he might be the victim of, he wasn't quite sure how to categorise it now that he came to think about it. It was either a crossed line in Destiny's switchboard or a rare and supernatural variation on an arranged marriage. Either way, that at least was something that Colin could be definite about. Either way, it sucked and he wanted no part of it. All the time he'd been telling the nice lady about it and listening to her explanation, his subconscious had been chewing doggedly over the available data on Ms. Cassie Clay, and to his surprise, he realised he'd somehow stumbled into a little pothole of clarity. He didn't love her, didn't even like her very much. She wasn't nice looking to him. She didn't make him laugh. He couldn't imagine sitting over empty plates with her in a restaurant, with the staff tapping their feet because it was past closing time, but these two lovebirds were still nattering away, oblivious of time. Now, famine? Sod it. He couldn't possibly think of her as that. Fam. If you rewound those criteria and replayed them with fam instead of Ms. Blasted Clay, it all played very smoothly indeed, which was probably, he was prepared to concede, because he was falling in love with her. Because it was boring and of no conceivable relevance to the widget founding industry, Colin hadn't taken much notice of the history they'd tried to squash into the space between his ears at school. But he did vaguely remember the American Declaration of Independence, which was when a bunch of ordinary people got pissed off of being shoved around by bullies and put a stop to it. No, they said. You can take all that and you can stuff it. Right then, here and now, a declaration of not taking any more of that from anybody, not from Supernature, which had no right to come splurging into his life without any warning, not from his own pathetic excuse for a personality, which couldn't even make up its mind who it was in love with until the nice lady had explained it all, not from all the Hollingsheads dead and gone, with their traditions and expectations and demands, and abso-bloody-lutely not from Dad. Screw what anyone thought of him. Shame and guilt and the whole shebang. Just as soon as his mess was sorted out, and Miss Clay was out of his life for good, and Dad had come to his senses and told the bad person to get lost, there would be a new dawn for Colin Hollinghead. On that glorious day, there'd be an empty bed and loads of free shelf space back at the family home. There'd be a vacancy for a junior gopher and blame receptacle at Hollingshead and Farron Limited. There'd be a tree poking up the stairwell with nobody to worry to death. He'd be off, out of it, gone. A flat of his own, a proper job, and with any luck, a nice-looking, cheerful girlfriend he could go to the pictures and annoy clock-watching waiters with. One small drift for a wimp. A massive break-up of tectonic plates for Colin kind. Yes, he decided, as he drained his second pint and wiped froth on his cuff. Why not? He looked up at the clock. 8:30. Options review. Well, he could go home, get moaned at for missing dinner, sit in front of the telly, go to bed. Alternatively, the world was at his feet, ready to thrill, chill and cloy him with an infinity of new experiences. Qualify that, a rather circumscribed range of experiences that could be sampled without spending money, since he now had a total of 27 pence. The number of things that you can experience in London in the 21st century for 27p is still pretty impressive, but offhand Colin couldn't think of many that he fancied. On the short list he was left with were things like a nice walk, a nice sit on a low wall, a nice lean in a doorway, stuff like that. Still, Washington and Jefferson and Ben Franklin had probably had to make their own amusements, and it hadn't broken their resolve. Of course, he reflected as he left the pub, it It'd all be different if I had, say, for the sake of argument, Fam here with me. Slot her into the equation and a nice walk, lean or sit on a low wall, would have a lot going for it. Now, if only he had her phone number, maybe he could do something about it. A quiet doorway, the mobile, directory inquiries. Name, please. E. Williams, Mortlake. Could he possibly be more specific, please, since at the last count there were over 110 E. Williamses in the designated search area? Envy, he clarified. Envy Williams. N.V. Williams. Not E. Williams? There's 6 N.V. Williamses in the designated search area. Can you be more specific? Thanks, Colin said. And forget it. Not to worry. Fam would be at the office tomorrow, and he could ask her in person. It'd constitute a significant step, of course, a diplomatic incident signalling a potential outbreak of amicabilities. But a man who's just evicted family tradition, predestined true love, and the devil from his life isn't put off by stuff like that. If she narrowed her eyes and asked him, "What do you want it for?" he'd simply smile and say, "So I can ring you up, stupid." And that'd be that sorted and out of the way. True, he'd known a Colin Hollinghead once who'd gone all droopy and wimpish at the thought of such a positive course of action. He could almost see him, far away below as he sailed through the clouds of newly accessible possibilities. Screw him in any case. He belonged in a strange, unreal world of unexplained trees and days spent stuffing envelopes, and Colin was beginning to find it hard to imagine that he'd ever believed in him. Someone jostled his arm. He opened his mouth for the instinctive automated apology and stuck like it, face open, like a door.
"Sorry,"
said the offending passerby.
"Oh, it's you. We meet again."
With his jaws still at half-mast, Colin could only nod his head. He wanted to look away, but his eyes had jammed and wouldn't move.
"You're young, Colin,"
the passerby said.
"Allow me to introduce myself. My name's Oscar." "We didn't have a chance to talk the other night,"
said Oscar.
"Since we'll be seeing quite a bit of each other in the future, we ought to establish the foundations of a working relationship. Get to know each other. Bond. Do you agree?"
Colin had once heard on the radio how much the average human head weighs. He couldn't remember the exact figure quoted, but whatever it had been, it was way off. Right now, as he tried to nod his up and down a second time, it definitely weighed at least a ton.
"Excellent. We should have..."
Pause while the nightmare vision calling itself Oscar appeared to be trying to remember something.
"We should drink a large number of alcoholic beverages, play darts, discuss team sports, motor vehicles, and women. Buy fried fish and sliced potatoes, and possibly urinate together in a shop doorway. That's the correct procedure, isn't it?"
"Love to," Colin croaked. "Only Oscar did something with its face that could possibly be interpreted as a frown."
"You have other commitments at this time. I understand. We should reschedule. I can make 18:45 hours on Thursday the 7th.
18:45?
18:45, precisely. The devil is in the detail."
Right. Colin tried to shut his mouth, but it wouldn't stay closed. I mean, I think that's okay, but I'd need to check. I'll call you."
Excellent.
A nod, carried out with Prussian precision.
"You can pass the message on to me through your father. If I haven't heard from you by noon tomorrow, I shall contact you. Is that acceptable?" "This was a fortuitous encounter. Be seeing you, kid. Aiden?"
A few footsteps, and the darkness swallowed it. Colin breathed out and flumped hard against the nearest wall. So much then for Paul Revere, Boston Harbour and Yankee Doodle Dandy. Maybe it wasn't going to be that easy after all. Or maybe he'd been more than usually stupid, imagining that he could simply walk out on such a comprehensive assortment of really bad things. What the hell was that?
Since we'll be seeing quite a bit of each other in the future.
If Stephen King could put together a half sentence, anything like as scary as that, the talking book rights alone would be enough to buy him Illinois. As the trembles and shudders began, Colin tried to remember what it had actually looked like, but nothing came to mind except 2 eyes. Perfectly ordinary they'd been, apart from the feeling they gave of being able to see everything. Colin thought of his father. Then he thought about trying to get clever with the likes of that. Pulling the proverbial wool over those eyes suddenly didn't seem such a piece of cake anymore, and presumably that was just the messenger, the gopher, probably in the diabolical hierarchy someone of equivalent standing to himself. Somehow that made the whole thing a lot worse. Anyhow, it had cleared up the small matter of where he was going to go next. Back into the pub for a stiff drink as any icicle. No, believe that, he only had 27 pence. He paused on the threshold and felt something crinkle in his shirt pocket. A £20 note, which he was almost positive hasn't been there before. For some reason this stroke of unexpected luck made him shudder. For a moment he was locked in a ferocious mental debate. On the one hand, his mother had warned him about accepting money from strange men, and he was pretty sure Oscar could safely be included in that category. On the other hand, 20 quid employed judiciously on licensed premises could make him feel a lot better, if only for a short while. The demon drink, he thought. Humour. It helped. A little. It didn't make the horror go away, but it took the razor edge off it. Colin followed it up with a repeat prescription, which had no appreciable effect. He thought about that, and reached a conclusion that after a jolt as sobering as that, he'd probably be able to drink for a week before he slurred so much as a preposition. Colin? Voices calling him again. No wonder if Joan of Arc ended up so stroppy. He raised his head and saw a face he sort of recognised. Not that he cared a damn, since he really wasn't in the mood, but at a guess he'd say it belonged to... "It's me," said the voice. "Steve Gillett. You remember? St. George's Secondary." "Steve," said Colin. What the face was saying was, of course, true up to a point. Anyhow, yes, he'd been at school with the face's owner, whose second name, now he came to think of it, was indeed Gillett. But his first name had been Snotty, and Colin was pretty sure that he'd always disliked him intensely, unless, of course, he was getting him muddled up with someone else. "Fancy seeing you again," said Snotty Gillett, sitting down opposite. "What's it been? 9 years?" "8, Colin said, and added, with the absolute minimum of enthusiasm, "So, have you been keeping?" "Not so bad, thanks. You?" "Still breathing." Snotty seemed to find that painfully funny. He still snorted like a donkey when he laughed. "You went into your dad's company, didn't you?" "That's right," Colin replied. "Still there?" "Just about." If anything, that was even funnier. It was so funny that if the game show compers ever got to hear of it, they'd send scouts out on camels to find Colin, bearing gold, frankincense and myrrh. "So," Colin said, "what about you?" "Oh, I'm with Lemon. Joined them 18 months ago, and I'm an area manager." "Lemon?" "Lemon," Snotty repeated. "You know, the mobile phone network." "Oh, right." Colin grinned feebly, aware that his prestige had just foundered. No point being the funniest man on earth if he was still living in the 19th century. "Area manager," he repeated. "Not bad." Snotty shrugged, a gesture intended to convey modesty. "A failure." "It's a great product," he said. "I just stand back and let it sell itself. Oh, hang on a tick." He turned around in his seat and waved to someone. "My girlfriend," he said. "She's bringing the drinks. Talking of which, what'll you have?" "I'm fine, thanks." "Same again, then." Snotty stood up and semaphored toward the bar. Apparently 2 fingers of the left hand uplifted while the right pats the top of the head is the international code for a large scotch. "So," Snotty went on, "you married?" Colin shook his head. Going steady?
No. Right, still playing the field.
Snotty grinned, and Colin ached for an apple to stick in his mouth.
See anything of the old gang?
Colin was about to shake his head when he caught sight of someone over Snotty's shoulder. She was carrying a tray, on which rested a pint of lager, something colourful with fruit in it, and, believe it or not, a double whisky. An echo sounded inside Colin's head. Snotty's voice, saying,
My girlfriend. Minnie, this is an old mate of mine from school, Colin Hollinghead. Colin, Minnie Williams.
The penny dropping. The tinkle as it pitched. Fa-min. Minnie. She said hello. The way she said it, the word had volume, colour and tone. What a nice surprise, it said. The other penny dropping. Clunk.
Of course, Snotty exclaimed. Hollingshead and Ferrin. That's where you're working, right?
She nodded, but she wasn't looking at Snotty. She was also smiling. There ought to be a dictionary of smiles, somewhere you can look them up and find out what they mean. It'd be a genuine service to humanity. But instead there's just Jane's Fighting Ships and the Observer Book of British Birds. Stuff like that. In the absence of a definitive reference, the only option is a mixture of experience and intuition. Even so, if that smile didn't mean, oh good, maybe this evening won't be such a drag after all, Colin was prepared to comb the local charity shops for a grey fedora and eat it. As soon as he'd reached that conclusion, Colin was immediately at a complete loss for words. Luckily though, Snotty seemed to regard a word driven in edgeways as an affront to his alpha male status. He talked about the old days at school, the mobile phone industry, scandalous examples of bad driving he'd recently witnessed, and seemed not to notice that his audience was not listening. In fact, they were as lost to him as the cities of the Incas, and the fool was too busy with the virtues of the latest Nokia even to notice. There was something faintly unreal about it. Minnie was smiling at Colin, and he was smiling back, while the sound of poor old Snotty's voice hung in the background like the faint whisper of a distant waterfall. Abruptly, in mid-sentence, Snotty stood up and said, "Same again." They nodded. He went away. Colin took a deep breath, but she spoke first. "Was he that boring at school?" she said.
"Actually, no," Colin replied. "As I recall, he was more on the joke side of things. Mind you, we had some very boring teachers, which must be where he got the inspiration from."
She smiled a bit, and if he wasn't the funniest man in the world anymore, it really didn't matter. "Did he say I'm his girlfriend?"
"Yes." Pause. "An exaggeration."
"Too bloody right." She frowned. "But at the moment, it's go out with him or stay home with the family." Shrug. "I thought of signing up for conversational Spanish instead, but classes don't start till the spring."
"Ah, do you like Spain?"
"Not much."
"I see. Well, in that case."
Colin contemplated writing down Fam's phone number on a beer mat, but there didn't seem any point. Its digits were burnt into his heart and mind like a brand on a Texan steer. He was as likely to forget it on the way home as Moses would have been to forget the 5th commandment on reaching the bottom of Mount Sinai. In a way, the evening turned out something like that scenario he'd been toying with earlier.
So wrapped up in talking that we lost track of time.
It would have been closer to the model if all the talking hadn't been done by Snotty Gillett. But never mind. Near enough for country music, as his Uncle Phil insufferably said. Chucking out time came by. They went 3 separate ways. "See you in the morning," she said. And if they'd been in Berkeley Square instead of Mortlake, he could have paused to listen to the nightingale. Instead, when she'd gone, he lifted his head a little, looked at the sky and said, "Thanks," just in case anybody was listening. Then he recited a string of 11 numbers, which made all the difference. Still chanting integers softly to the moon, Colin started to walk home. At the corner of the street, someone stepped out of the shadows in front of him, barred his way and said, "Finally!" It was what's-her-name, Connie Schwartz-Albrecht. "What are you?" He started to ask, "Have you got any idea how long I've been standing here waiting for you?" she said, sounding more than a little like his mother.
Sorry?
Connie sighed. "Well," she said, "never mind about that now," and stabbed him in the throat with a pair of nail scissors. My crikey, that was a bit of a cliffhanger for the end of chapter 8. So, chapter 9 will be here in a couple of days. As you probably know by now, I always complete the whole book, and I really appreciate it if you could hit the notifications bell, hit the like button, leave me a comment if you want to, share if you want to, follow if you want to. I really, really appreciate you listening. I appreciate all of your comments, and let's be honest, this is a spanking cliffhanger. So, I'll be back in a couple of days. I look forward to seeing you, and take it easy. Stay safe, Petal.